Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. It is officially campaign season ahead of the federal election on April 28th. But with just 35 days until you head to the polls, how are you feeling about the political leaders and their promises? What are the biggest issues that Canadians are facing, and who would you like to see leading our country? And recent polls are showing the Conservatives and Liberal Party are virtually tied. But what else can the polls tell us? I'm Amy Bell, in for Michelle Elliott, and this is BC Today. And thank you for joining us on radio, TV, and live stream. You can call us now on our top story. Just who are you planning to vote for in the upcoming federal election? And what issues matter the most to you? Our number is 604-669-3733. You can also call 1-800-825-5950 or hit pound 690 on your cell phone. You can always email us, bctoday@cbc.ca. It is day 2 of the election campaign, and with just 35 days before people cast their votes across the country, the party leaders are staking their political claims. Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives say that they will cut the rate of tax on the lowest tax bracket from 15% to 12.75%, which will cut taxes individuals pay by about $900 a year, or $1,800 per two-income family.
So I'll tell you what we are going to do. We will be cutting bureaucracy, cutting consultants, cutting back on handouts to insiders, and we will cut back on foreign aid to bring our money home to this country. We will also, and those will be spelled out in our platform with numbers to show how we will reduce the cost of government so that we can leave more money in the pockets of the hardworking Canadians behind me. We'll also bring in a dollar-for-dollar law.
Liberal leader Mark Carney disputes the Conservatives' plans and says his party offers a more balanced approach.
It's a fundamental difference in our approach. We have a balanced approach. He has a simple approach. I recall that Mr. Poilievre, when COVID began, his solution was, let's have a tax cut. His response with the tariff war and the revenue that the government is collecting from the retaliatory tariffs, he said, I'm going to use that to cut taxes. We say we're going to use that to protect workers who are directly affected by, and that's what we've done. That's what we've done with the changes we announced over last week.
And NDP leader Jagmeet Singh took aim at both Carney and Poilievre when it comes to affordable housing.
Pierre Poilievre wants to sell off federal land. He wants to sell it off, all of it, to rich developers and rich builders and build homes that you cannot afford. That's his plan. He wants to sell it off to companies like Mark Carney's former company so that they can make lots of profits and they're not in it for you. And Mark Carney's plan, very similarly, he wants to sell off this land and build mostly homes that you can't afford. Neither of these guys are in it for you. So the question in this election is, who's going to build homes that you can actually afford?
So what does matter most to you for this election? Who will you be supporting? And how much will U.S. President Trump influence who wins the Canadian federal election? Call us now at 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733, pound 690 on your cell phone. You can email bctoday@cbc.ca. Joining us now is Edana Beauvais, an associate professor of political science at Simon Fraser University. Edana, hi, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So obviously heading into a very exciting time in Canadian politics, but this will be an incredibly brief and likely intense campaign. What are your feelings as we head into it, early days, what the most important issues for Canadians will be to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the biggest issue that's on the top of everyone's minds is this assimilation threat from the U.S. And the economic consequences of tariffs. So I think that's going to be that is the big hot button issue, the big surprise issue that has really defined this election and sort of, flipped things on their head from where they were back in December, for example. when, as you recall, Trudeau was incredibly unpopular. The Liberals were looking to get, wiped off the electoral map. And only a few months later now, it's looking, like it's possible for the Liberal Party to even potentially win a majority.
It has been an incredible flip. And we're just seeing, of course, how much President Trump and any statements or issues that he makes can have an incredible and quick impact here. Is that the main focus that all leaders are going to have to really funnel their energy into, just proving that they're the ones that can take on Trump, whatever that means, whether it's tariffs or annexation?
Yeah, I think that's going to be the big hot button issue. I mean, there's a lot of issues facing Canadians that haven't been resolved related to things like affordability, housing. And these are issues that I think were really benefiting the Conservatives before the assimilation threat. And there are issues that should have benefited the NDP party, but the NDP, for whatever reason, even before we saw this more recent resurgence in Liberal fortunes, they just were struggling to kind of capitalize on these issues, which was a bit of a surprise to me. But since now we've had this sort of assimilation threat, I think the biggest change we've seen is this sort of resurgence of Canadian patriotism, which we're seeing across the country, including in Quebec. And that is becoming a huge liability for anyone with kind of separatist agendas. So it's hurting the bloc in Quebec for sure. And I think it's also making some of the rhetoric coming out of Western Canada, and it's making leaders or affiliations with people like Danielle Smith a bit of a liability for the Conservatives. Because, nobody wants to, so for those of you who haven't been paying attention, Danielle Smith is the Premier of Alberta, and she has kind of come up with this wish list of demands for the federal government, including some things that are unrelated to tariffs. So she wants to take Albertan oil off the negotiating table, but then she also has some things related to single-use plastics and so on. And she has sort of said that if the federal government doesn't come into line on these issues, there's going to be a national unity crisis. And I think this kind of rhetoric is a bit tone deaf at a moment of Canadian sort of patriotic fervor. And because Poilievre has sort of said that Smith is, quote unquote reasonable, and he's sort of cozied up to her, I think it's going to be a bit of a liability to sort of try and wrap himself in the Canadian flag while also being friendly with people who are threatening to tear the country apart, essentially.
And we did see quite a bit of press and uproar over Smith's comments on an interview, I believe it was a couple of weeks ago, but they really came to a head over the weekend, where she essentially was trying to work with the Trump administration to pause the tariffs in an effort to sort of bolster that support for Poilievre and the Conservatives.
Correct. That's exactly right. She had an interview with Breitbart where she had sort of said, let's pause the tariffs because it's benefiting the Liberals, and we can talk about it after the election. So, whatever she's trying to insinuate, what it might sound like to a Canadian voter is it might sound like she's offering a kind of deal, like, hey, help the Conservatives get into power, and then the Conservatives will help you out.
Right.
I don't think that kind of suggestive tit for tat, or sort of you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, is going to play well with, again, sort of Canadians who are feeling very patriotic at this moment.
Yeah,
right?
It's company that a lot of Canadians perhaps don't want to cozy up to right now. Edana, I don't mean to interrupt you, but we have so many calls coming in, and I'd really like to get a few more of our audience inputs here. We'll head to Jim in Spence's Bridge. Hi, Jim. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome.
So what are you feeling as we head towards this election?
Well, I'm feeling deja vu or Groundhog Day here. Another election, another election with leaders cramming their policies down on us. This is an undemocratic process. The people aren't making the laws. The leader of the country is. Very similar to the United States. But what I'm fearing from the big party candidates is they want to develop more oil and more mines across this country to expand the mining and oil industry economies. And we don't need to drill more and tear up more land. We need to sell the products we have to alternative markets, maintain the economy, don't grow it massively like the politicians want to do, because code word for economic growth is population growth. And I think Canadians are tired of high housing prices and such. And I'd also like to see our political leaders talking about how they're going to build up our military to protect Canadians against any threat in the world. And I would suggest we should have a debate on developing weapons of mass destruction, similar to what Pakistan has, and being able to protect ourselves. That's the best negotiation chip we can have to protect our sovereignty.
All right, Jim.
In this day and age.
Thank you so much for those thoughts, Jim. And Dina, he sort of touched on the military. And again, that's a major issue of security that many people are grappling with that isn't typically front of mind as we head into an election. How key is that going to be?
I think that's something that's going to come up more in this election for sure. I mean, typically, Canadian military is not the top of Canadian voters' minds. But in this election, when we are, facing a real threat, I think, of assimilation by a foreign power, and frankly, that foreign power supplies us with most of our military supplies.
Yeah.
I mean, the fighter jets that we use, we depend on Americans to service them and for parts. And so switching over to, for instance, like a European provider, it will be very costly. And training and things like that in the military, but I think that's definitely a conversation that Canadians are going to have, and those are going to be some tough decisions that will have to be made, and that is something I think that is going to come up, and we'll see. I mean, the leaders haven't taken strong positions. I think so far just Carney has said that he will cancel the current contract for the F-35s with the US. But I think we'll probably have to wait to the debates for those kind of issues to be clarified between the leaders.
We've got another call coming in from Pete in Vancouver. Hi, Pete. Thanks for joining BC today.
Thanks. My issue is mental health, specifically ADHD.
Okay.
So while the provinces are responsible for health, they get a massive amount of money. And one of the conditions is they have to follow the Medicare Protection Act, right? And so here in BC and in other provinces, they are violating the Canada Medicare Act. In BC, they're violating their own laws, the BC Medicare Protection Act, which is supposed to require public administration. They privatized ADHD diagnosis. If you're rich enough to drop $500 for a diagnosis for a nurse practitioner, you can do it. It's hard to find someone who's properly trained. They're not doing it. So I think that the government should require, at the barest minimum, that if they're giving billions of dollars to the province, they stop discriminating against the human rights of people with ADD who are often too stigmatized to speak out. And Carney's talking about homelessness. Pierre is talking about homelessness. 27% of homeless people have ADD, a 33-year long follow-up study. We have huge rates of substance use disorder, 20 to 40% plus. 21 to 45% of prisoners have ADHD in jail. I did a post with 15 studies. And so it's, even if you don't care about us as humans, if you pay and require the doctors to have mandatory CME courses on ADHD and you ban the provinces from discriminating, it's going to be cheaper for Canadians in the long run because we're very expensive to ignore. And would you rather have people being entrepreneurs with ADHD or criminal entrepreneurs self-medicating? It's violating the laws. ADDers are too stigmatized to speak up and talk to the media or talk to their politicians. But you, as a Canadian taxpayer, you're paying a lot of money. Go Google economic costs of ADHD.
Pete, I thank you for sharing that with us. We've got time for another call now from Roman in Port Alberni. Hi, Roman. How are you feeling about the election?
I think it's actually good timing to have him right now because
how so?
At this point in time, I'm going to I'm going to acknowledge the irony of this fact is it was an American president whose words should resonate with all of us right now, in that they say, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country.
Right,
And
JFK.
our civic duty as voters is to put aside our differences and our personal needs for wants of the things that can be handled at the moment when we have that other certainty taken care of, which is the imminent threats against us as a nation. And I'll also state this is a ship can be in the middle of the ocean surrounded by water. It will be safe from sinking until any of that water can start to get inside the infrastructure of the ship, meaning if there's a leak in the hull. So we need to be strong, we need to be united, and we need to have integrity through and through. And as an Indigenous person, I would certainly love to have my priorities put front and forward, but I understand the process of being a sovereign nation as Canada is, and would rather see us be able to stand on our feet. And I think being creative in establishing our economic policy is a clear way and a clear path through this, because at this point in our existence, we have reliances that are no longer guarantees. And I think creative economics is our path through this.
Roman, thank you for sharing that with us. And Edana, Roman sort of speaks to what we've talked about and what we are seeing is this incredible sort of sovereignty and patriotism that we don't typically necessarily, it's not that we don't feel it, definitely not so vocal about it. We tend to be more low-key about that in Canada, but it is becoming, to the forefront. Are we seeing this, uniting people in a way that could benefit the government, no matter who's elected, that will continue that momentum of staying a bit more connected instead of these sort of divisions among party lines?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I think one of the silver linings of this external threat has been, well, for one thing, Canadians really thinking hard about how to support our local economy, how to diversify economically away from the U.S., to move away from our dependence on the U.S. military, and then also this kind of, like a motive, this national question, this feeling of unity. I think it's been really nice, and I hope that this is something that sticks around so that we can, really think about what we have in common, and what we have in this great country, and what's worth protecting and preserving.
Do you see any, sort of in terms of the different leaders and the parties, any specific maybe weaknesses that they really need to address if they are to convince people to vote them into power?
Yeah, there's specific weaknesses. I guess for the Conservative Party, the thing that they're going to have to speak convincingly to is just that, they really have Canadians' best interests at heart, and not sort of Donald Trump's agenda. They're not just going to, give their buddies what they want, or that Trump is not their buddy. The Liberals under Carney, I think, I'm surprised it hasn't been more of an issue, but I think it's just, making that distance between Carney and Trudeau. Remember, I mean, I guess our political memories are pretty short, but Trudeau was pretty unpopular. So Canadians were pretty, you think about some of the recent BC ridings. There was a recent by-election in BC and in Cloverdale Langley that the Liberals held. It was a tight race in 2021, and the recent by-elections, the Conservatives took it with 2/3 of the vote. And so that was really sort of a commentary on Trudeau's unpopularity. And now the question is whether the Liberals can distance themselves enough from Trudeau and potentially take ridings like that back. And then the NDP and the Bloc really have just to convince voters that they're still relevant. I mean, for the Bloc, voters in Quebec, first off, there is this resurgence of Canadian patriotism, but even among Quebecois patriots, nationalists who don't have any love for Canada, they are looking at the US and they're realizing hey, within a USA assimilated Quebec, we're going to have absolutely no language rights, absolutely no cultural rights.
Right.
And so, we are better off within this framework of Canada, which makes the Sovereigntist Party look somewhat irrelevant. And for the NDP, for whatever reason, they have not been able to capitalize on Trudeau's unpopularity. And they also haven't really been able to take advantage of this resurgence of Canadian patriotism, which often coincides with leftist feelings in Canada. For various reasons. And so I think they're going to have to look hard internally, and, depending on the outcome of this election, if they do worse than they did in 2021, they might have to look hard at their leadership.
And we've only got a quick minute before we run out of time here, but parting words before we let you go, Edana, what do you just want people to keep in mind as they, head to the polls in 35 days?
Yeah, actually, what I would like people to keep in mind, and what I think, what I hope to see with this election is record-breaking turnout.
Yes.
Because voting is an act of self-determination, right? And it's something that we take for granted. A lot of people think it's politics as usual. You can always vote. It's your right. Well, you know what? It turns out it's also your duty, and it can be taken away from you.
Yeah.
So, I don't think we're going to become the 51st state, but, if we did, imagine your future self looking back and wishing that you had voted in that last Canadian election.
Exactly. We need to get out there. No matter who you're voting for, your vote will make a difference. Edana, it was such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking time with us today.
For having me.
Okay, bye-bye. Edana Beauvais, Associate Professor of Political Science at Simon Fraser University. It is 12:27, and this is BC Today. Now, last week, we asked the question, are tariffs changing your grocery buying habits? Here's what some of you had to say. From Dave, sprouts are a source of fresh, healthy, organic produce, which anyone can grow in their kitchen. All you need is a large glass jar, water, and a few minutes each day. A small amount of seeds will produce a large amount of fresh greens for your salads and cooking. There are a large amount of varieties of seeds available online through Canadian companies, some local to BC, like West Coast Seeds in Delta. Frank on Buying Canadian, sure, I'd love to, but it's double what it was a week ago just for the Buy Canadian label. Example, 1 kilogram frozen mac and cheese, $12, should be no more than $8. Maybe Canada needs to die to live again. Government says they are willing to impoverish all to fight Trump. It's happening already. And Grace speaks to the issues she faces while she is getting food delivered online due to a disability. She orders what she needs through the Save on Foods website and tries to shop Canadian to stay within budget, but it's getting harder and harder as those food costs go up. She tries to only buy what's on sale, and there are times she has to make a difficult decision and try to stay healthy. She also mentions that sometimes what she ordered isn't what was delivered, so she has to try to keep that in mind for the next time she orders. She's hopeful that it is easier for people that are buying in store, but for online, it is still an issue. Thank you so much for everybody that is always contacting us via email. We're still going to take your calls. We'll be talking election for the rest of the show, and we'll have your thoughts on polls and the issues ahead. And this is BC Today on CBC. We're on Radio 1, CBC Television, and live streaming on our website, cbc.ca/BC, YouTube at CBC Vancouver, and on the CBC News app. And speaking of news, here is Robert Zimmerman.
Good afternoon. Crews here in the Lower Mainland were called to two fires early this morning, one in Surrey, the other here in downtown Vancouver. The first was around 2:30 and swept through a strip mall along King George Boulevard. The second was in an abandoned building on Granville Street. There are no reports of injuries in either fire. Police in Victoria are marking 34 years since the disappearance of Michael Dunahee. Dunahee was 4 years old when he disappeared from a Victoria school playground while his family was nearby. The case remains one of the largest missing persons investigations in Canada. And a collision has closed a portion of Highway 97 near Summit Lake, 50 kilometers north of Prince George. Emergency services are currently on scene. Police say an alternate route for small vehicles is expected to become available, but it may not be suitable for larger trucks. And now the forecast. A rainfall warning continues for sections of the Fraser Valley on the north coast. A mix of sun and cloud this afternoon with a high of 9. Highs around 10 degrees and mainly sunny in the Peace. In the central interior, including Prince George, lots of sunshine with a high of 8. Highs from 10 to 13 with periods of rain this afternoon in the West Kootenay, mainly cloudy in the East Kootenay. In the southern interior, including Kelowna, a chance of showers with a high of 12. And for Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria, and the Fraser Valley, periods of rain this afternoon with highs reaching 11 degrees. That's your CBC News update from Vancouver.
Thank you very much, Robert. We will talk to you soon. And we are seeing new candidates throw their hat into the federal ring. Among those contenders is former Vancouver Mayor Gregor Robertson, who will be the new Liberal candidate for the riding of Vancouver, Fraserview, South Burnaby. The seat used to be held by former Liberal Minister Harjit Sajjan. Robertson has been out of politics for 7 years, but he told the Early Edition this morning these unprecedented times inspired him to run.
People who are experienced at the local level, know how cities run, people who have been in business, which is a stark contrast between Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre, Poilievre's never had a job outside of politics. So, we need people who bring a lot of skills on the ground, who can get things done, who understand the depth of the challenges that we face, whether that's on housing or dealing with our neighbors to the south and our economic opportunities, defending our sovereignty. So I think, at this point, I know I can bring a lot to the table from my background here as the mayor of Vancouver.
And as we heard in the first half hour of the program, political party leaders are pitching their visions for the future of Canada. And as the calendar flipped over to the new year, various polls showed a double-digit lead by the Conservatives over the governing Liberals. But thanks to the trade war with Donald Trump in the United States and with reinvigorated Liberal Party under newly elected leader Mark Carney, the race is now neck and neck. So how do you feel heading into a federal election? And how much weight do you put on election polling? Call us at 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733, pound 690 on your cell phone. And you can email bctoday@cbc.ca. We've still got lots of calls on from our first half, so stay on the line and we will get to as many of you as we can. Joining us in studio right now is pollster Mario Canseco. He is the president of Research Co. Hello, Mario. Thanks for coming in.
My pleasure, Amy. Great to be here.
As you were saying, it's kind of heading into your Super Bowl. Busy time for you.
And with so many unexpected twists and turns, the first week of January, the Conservatives were riding high, more than half of decided voters in BC and in Ontario saying they would vote for them. Now it's a whole different ballgame.
I know. It really did look like it was a lock that, perhaps a majority government for the Conservatives. And now we've seen that that lead be completely dismantled. Are you've been in this arena for a very long time. Are you still easily shocked? Has this quick turnaround shocked you?
It happened quickly, but I think the reason for it is what happened with Donald Trump. I think that we had a lot of Canadians who maybe didn't like Donald Trump to begin with, But those who like them are now seeing the impact that his actions and his tweets and his statements can have. And I think that is what's making Canadians pay more attention to what is essentially transpiring in the U.S. and how it can affect our own federal election.
Yeah, and I think it's not typically we all know we have such a close relationship with the U.S. That's not in dispute, but I think having it at the forefront of an election is very much unprecedented, as we talked about. I'll bring in a call right now from Carrie in Wendell. Hi, Carrie. Thanks for staying on the line.
Oh, hi.
Hi. How are you feeling about the election?
So I have a lot of friends and family who are Donald Trump supporters here in the Kootenays. And the thing about it is that every single one of them is a conservative. They're all conservative voters. It's estimated that about 20% of people that will be voting conservative are also Trump supporters. That's 1 in 5. And that number is that's just too high for me. I can't see voting for a group of people who are also part of that group is they're on the wrong team.
So it's not so much about who the Canadian leaders are here. You are just going to cast your vote to make sure we don't have any interference from the U.S. leader, President Trump.
Well, absolutely. I mean, who does he hate the most? He hates liberals. He really does. I don't care what he says. I know him too well. He hates liberals. And, he's happy to say it. The libtards is but they forget that it's give me liberty or give me death, If this is the group that is going to fight the best against the oppressor, this is the greatest existential threat to my country in my lifetime, and this is important. This is a big deal. I mean, if you're siding with conservatives, I can't see how that slippery slope down that same road of conservatism gets you, past to what the enemy is, right?
Well, Carrie, thank you so much for calling. And Mario, you're nodding. You do not seem surprised by Carrie's sentiments. And is that what you're seeing sort of in the research that you've been doing? It's just very focused on not having any interference by Trump?
Especially for one reason, and I think that's a key to the exercise, which is how much we've seen the level of Canadians who are worried about Canada-U.S. relations rising.
Right.
We're in field right now, and we have roughly a third of Canadians who are telling us, I am worried about this at this particular stage, more than housing, more than the economy and jobs, more than the environment. So it's a unique election because what is happening in the U.S. is having a direct impact in our voting intention.
And in terms of sort of where we were in the polls, in the last research federal election at the beginning of January, you had the Conservatives leading the Liberals by 16 points, 47 to 21, with the NDP sitting in third with 15% support. So the new polls released just days before the writ was dropped on the weekend has showed that race narrowing to just a couple of points between the Liberals and the Conservatives. Is it atypical to see not a big turnaround, but for it to happen in such a short amount of time?
It's unique in that sense because it definitely plays a role into the complexities that we're going to be seeing with the minor parties. You look at the NDP, for instance, they can drop to levels that they haven't had since the 2000 election under Alexa McDonough. So that's a problem for them. That could mean that some of your incumbents are going to be losing their seats. Also complicated for the Greens, also complicated for the Bloc, because what we're seeing in Quebec is really staggering. It's essentially your hard-boiled sovereignist voter essentially taking a second look at things and saying, do we want to push for sovereignty right now?
Right.
When the country we want to leave is being targeted by the Americans. So this is going to be a very crucial aspect for them at this stage. Are we better off ensuring that the federal Liberals stay in power, and then we can chat about separation?
It's sort of prioritizing what you ultimately want to get, but focusing on those current threats. We'll take another call in from Heidi in Surrey. Hi, Heidi. Thanks for joining BC Today.
Hello. Oh my. I became
I think
a citizen
that sums up a lot of people's feelings.
65 years ago.
Okay.
And I've always voted, of course, that's for sure. And I have to admit that most of the time I voted Conservative. But I'm also a very informed history person, and Mr. Poilievre scares me a lot. And I have a little slogan, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I would like to say, if you admire Trump, vote for Poilievre. If you love this country, please vote with your conscience.
Very well said. And where did you immigrate from, Heidi?
I came from Germany.
Okay.
And I was a young girl, and since then I've educated myself about the history of a certain gentleman becoming the power in Germany, and what happened before and after. And matter of fact, I'm just reading a book about it, and it's scaring me a lot. But I must say I have allowed myself to exhale a little more since Mark Carney took over the Liberals, and I feel a little better. But Mr. Poilievre scares me a lot because I have little great-grandchildren growing up in this country, and I love Canada, and please, not Poilievre, please.
All right, Heidi, thank you so much for calling in and for sharing that sentiment. Mario, I do want to get back to what you were saying in terms of Quebec and seeing that huge switch there. Is there a way you can or you've seen province by province where those political parties are standing? I know that certain provinces are a little more conservative leaning and many are much more liberal. So how are we looking at this stage?
Well, in Alberta, we continue to see the Conservatives dominating, not at the level that they had a couple of months ago, because now you have more people looking at the Liberals as an option. BC is going to be fascinating to watch because we're seeing a significant drop for the NDP to the benefit of the Liberals. So we could have two-horse races in most of the areas that we're polling on.
Right.
And Ontario, the difference is between 4 or 6 points, but we know that that is significant if it's in the favor of the Liberals when it comes to the level of seats. So we know that this isn't really one election. It's 343 different elections combined into one. So the way you feel about some of the local candidates plays a role. And to me, the main issue that is probably going to keep me up at night in the next month is voter turnout. Are we going to have a voter turnout that is significantly higher than in the past? We haven't reached 75% since the 2 elections we had in the 1980s. Could we see something like this? Is your average voter who says they're all crooks, they're all terrible, going to look at this and do the research and cast a ballot? Because we've never been threatened this way by our southern neighbors.
No, and we're seeing that huge sentiment of feeling very patriotic, and I'm seeing a lot of Canadian flags being flown. But will that translate into what we typically see, to combat what we typically see as very poor voter turnout? We spoke with our last guest, and she was urging people the same, as you're heading to the polls, that is your duty for your country. I just want to read an email that we had come in from Toby, and it says, "What I often wonder about polling is what happens to the people who don't pick up a call from an unknown number from a polling firm. This must influence the accuracy of polling numbers, and how do they account for that?" I think of no better person to answer this, Mario.
I'll be happy to deal with this one.
And I do think there are people's questions about polling that we do want to get to. So.
Of course. Well, we need to look at polling as seeking a representative sample. So you got to have, if you're doing a survey of 1,000 Canadians, you got to make sure that the age demographics make sense based on census targets, the genders, the regions. So it's not that complicated for a pollster to find somebody who fits that profile in a country with so many people as Canada. This has changed the way in which we collect data. A lot of it is now happening online, happening with interactive voice recognition. So I'm not here to suggest that one methodology might be superior to the other, but it's definitely problematic. We're not in the same situation we were in the 1980s when everybody was happy to take your phone call. Now it's no longer the same.
No, and does that cause any of the information to be skewed because certain perhaps demographics are more apt to pick up a phone call while others are more apt to participate in an online way?
Well, this is something that really affected my colleagues in the United Kingdom during the Tony Blair election, the second Tony Blair election, because a lot of the phone calls were happening in the early stages of the day. So you were more likely to find homemakers, people who weren't employed at the time, who were more likely to vote for the Conservatives. The way to do this is to ensure that that your sample is going to be properly balanced. And it's an art in a way, but it's also the only easy way in which you can get this done. I mean, it's not about calling 1,000 people. You need to call the right 1,000 people.
Okay, understandable. Are there ever any concerns that if somebody were to look at a poll and see, oh, the Liberals have gained a lot of ground, I don't need to worry so much about what my vote means. Is there ever a worry of voter complacency depending on what they perceive in the polls?
You know, it's really tough to tell whether that has an effect. And I always point to the example of the 2022 elections in Quebec and in Ontario, where every single survey that was published in either of those two campaigns essentially said the incumbent party is going to win.
Right.
The CAQ in Quebec and the PCs in Ontario. And the level of voter participation was very different in the two provinces. It was closer to 75 or 73%, if I recall correctly, in Quebec, and it was lower than 50% in Ontario. So it's not as if somebody looks at a poll and says, my vote doesn't count.
Okay.
I've never encountered anybody who felt that way.
Okay, good to know. We'll take in another call from Laura in Chilliwack. Hi, Laura. What is your top election issue heading into the poll this year?
Well, the top election issue is to make sure that Canada survives the onslaught from Trump. And for that reason, as a lifelong New Democrat of 79 years old now, there's no way I'm going to vote anyway but Liberal, because I see Mark Carney as the only hope to keep our country strong.
And why do you see Carney as being the one that can keep Canada safe?
Well, he is intelligent. He has experience. He communicates very well. He's measured. He's not excessive. He's a good leader in the areas where he has been leading before. And besides that, I just think he's trustworthy. He comes across as somebody who actually has looked carefully at issues and realizes what's really on the line here. And it's not the kind of Trumpian antics that I hear echoed in Poilievre's statements. He cares about Canada, and I care about Canada, and I care about the CBC, as a matter of fact, too. And I really want to see you guys sticking around because you make all the difference in my being aware of what's happening. And I know I can trust you, too.
Well, thank you very much for that. And thank you for joining us today. We'll take one more call from Diane in Campbell River. Hi, Diane.
Hi, I'm just calling because, I voted many different ways, but this is such an important election. I'm in North Vancouver Island, and Vancouver Island traditionally has voted NDP, with the fight being between the Conservatives and the NDP. In this election, our sitting member of Parliament, who's NDP, has stepped down. And so I'm really worried that the NDP on the island are going to split the vote between the Liberals and the Conservatives. And I just wanted to say, in this election, for me, like, strategic voting is just going to have to be the way I need to go, because BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan are typically conservative leaning, and every vote counts. Like I say, I'm really trying to get people, make sure that they get out to vote.
Well, thank you.
And I think, if you split the vote, then you get some really interesting election results, because it's not necessarily who gets all the total votes, it's who wins that riding, right?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for joining us, Diane. And it is interesting that the vote splitting does come up a lot, and strategic voting is not something a lot of people are necessarily comfortable with. They want to vote for the party they believe in, but as we are hearing, just talking about a sample of the population, as we're just hearing briefly today, there seems to be that overwhelming response of the party itself doesn't matter. It's the person they see able to go head to head with Trump.
I think that's going to be one of the major issues that defines the race. And we could go back to 2015 when we had a very concerted effort to try to deal with strategic voting. Vote for the NDP in this riding if you don't want Harper to form the government again. Vote for the Liberals in this riding if you don't want Harper to form the government again. But at the end of the election, we had a massive level of support for the Liberals, which renders strategic voting essentially useless. It's going to be tough to figure out what happens this time around, because the Liberals have only finished in first place in this province twice. 1968 through Romania 1, and 2015 through Romania 2.
Okay. We will see what shakes out as we get into we'll get closer and closer to the election. I know that in the province we saw an incredibly tight election last fall. So the NDP won 47 seats, and then the Conservatives with 44. How do you think those provincial results will compare in terms of what we see in the federal election? Will it come down to the wire that we are neck and neck right to the very, very end?
I think it'll be very similar in BC. And part of the reason is we're dealing with a third party that is sort of faltering. In the case of BC, it was BC United, ultimately not actually fielding candidates in the election. But if the NDP at the federal level starts to drop, and a lot of that support goes to the Liberals, we could have a lot of seats where it's a one versus a second party race. And this isn't great for the Greens either. You know, there's a complexity. There was a hope that they could get more than what they have at this particular stage, but the environment is no longer as big an issue thanks to the Donald Trump situation.
And, you know, I guess with the Liberals making up so much ground over the last couple of months, you know, where does that leave the NDP and the Greens, regardless of what happens in the election, just going forward as parties?
Well, it certainly speaks about a complexity in the way you organize. Are the Greens better off running a campaign that is completely Canada-wide if you're going to finish in 4th or 5th place in most of the ridings?
Right.
And what happens with the NDP? You could have that level of identification with incumbents. We saw this in the Ontario election. The NDP finishes in 3rd place when it comes to voting, but their most popular candidates get re-elected, and they have more seats than the Liberals. So could something like that happen if you spend your resources correctly?
All right. A few more calls coming in. It's been a hot topic today. Obviously, a lot of people have election on the brain. Shauna in Williams Lake, we'll take your call now. Thanks for calling in.
Hi.
And how are you feeling as we head into an election here?
I feel anxious, especially with the situation in the States and the deportations that are taking place. A lot of these immigrants who are at zero are being pushed to zero, are being forced into situations where they're being treated like criminals, being sent to El Salvador and Guantanamo Bay. And I think that I'm anxious about our country and the importance of alliancing with NATO countries. I would hope that our leaders would see an opportunity to offer an alternative to what Trump's doing and receive these deportees into our country, especially when they have no criminal record. And they can certainly, you know, where I don't know the logistics of entering into the military or the army, but those openings, you know, going from zero or being pushed to zero, I mean, even offering stipends to training, if they're willing to stand up for constitutional democracies, they can be trained in entry-level positions. Like, I think that's really important to be able to see the situation and act and offer an alternative.
Right. Step in to help. Thank you for that, Shauna. Time for a call now from Jack in Powell River. How are you feeling about the election, Jack?
Like everybody else, anxious.
Yeah, that seems to be the overriding sentiment.
Yeah, it is. Well, I guess as you know, as a Canadian, we have to be, right? But my point was going to get to, because I don't know how much time you got. When it comes to resumes, you know, Mark Carney has one hell of a resume, and so does Pierre Poilievre. I mean, but Pierre Poilievre's a politician. Mark Carney's a businessman. Right now, what do we want? Politician or a businessman? Right?
Yeah.
And my other point was Pierre Poilievre is awful negative. And if he could change his style of politicking, I think he'd be way better off.
And you think that they could recapture that lead that they had earlier in the year?
I don't know anything about that. I was a carpenter all my life. I don't know that stuff. But
oh no, don't sell yourself short.
It'd probably get my vote, maybe.
Okay.
You know,
All right.
just that he. Okay.
Well, thank you for that. And Mario, I'll throw that to you. Is there, we saw such a quick turnaround. Do you feel that there is still a path forward that the Conservatives can very quickly take back that lead?
It's a pendulum when you think about it. There's a moment when you look at Mark Carney and go, okay, now this is a safe, warm blanket. This is the person who's going to lead us to deal with Donald Trump. But the young voters, I think this is the biggest issue over the past 6 months. The young voters looking at the Conservatives more seriously than in elections past, both federally and provincially.
And do you think that this, more than perhaps past elections, will really see that the sort of demographics, the young voters versus the old voters, or older voters, sorry, that will really see that shaping the political landscape?
I think it might be higher than usual. Okay. And one of the things that led to the massive lead of the Conservatives was Generation X, people aged 35 to 54 who are experiencing the healthcare system differently because of their aging parents or their young children. They were with the Conservatives very solidly a couple of months ago. We'll see where they end up on April 28th.
And I expect, we could see a flip, we could see change, but do you expect it to remain this tight for the remainder of the campaigns?
I think it will be, and it's similar to the way in which campaigns have been running in other parts of the country, especially if you wind up in a situation where it becomes a referendum on Trump. You're ultimately voting for a government, which is usually something that happens in the last 3 or 4 days of the campaign. Oh, I wanted to vote Green or NDP, but I don't want the federal Conservatives to get back in. That is happening on the second day of the campaign and not on the final 3.
Is it only day 2?
Yes. It's impressive.
It is impressive, and I imagine we'll be touching base with you again in the future, and certainly we will be discussing the election in the coming weeks. So thank you to everybody that did call in and emailed us today, but we just didn't have time to get to everyone. Mario Canseco, of course, is the president of Research Co., and he joined us today. And I do have time for just a quick email from Linda. She said, I feel confident that PM Carney and the Liberal government is capable and better prepared to lead Canada through an election and the coming 4 years. The leaders of the opposition aren't prepared and don't have the international experience or expertise to navigate. And that is our show for today.